BBC English was created briefly after the founding of the British Broadcast Corporation. At the time, Lord Ray's had the ambitious project of standardizing through his company what he perceived as correct English, RP. However, despite the initial positive reaction, populace and announcers alike started to question the so-called norm. Even with its extensive influence worldwide, mainly on the ex-colonial countries, the BBC, in order to maintain its predominant position, understood that it could no longer present BBC English as the only acceptable variation. Thus, it started diversifying itself and accepting a wider range of accents among its announcers and among its staff. The aim of this presentation is to show how and why did BBC English become a standard, how the company fared against the increasing insatisfaction derived from the norm. It will also demonstrate how other English-speaking countries perceived this standard and how inevitably it started to change. The BBC was founded in 1922. Almost immediately after its creation, John Race, the founder, emphasized on the language educational role of the company. He was known for his strong stance on questions such as correct pronunciation in spoken English. In fact, this statement here makes it very easy to understand just how much Race idealized RP while rejecting other variations. It is certainly true that even the commonest and simplest words are subjected to horrible and grotesque abuse. One hears the most appalling travesties of vile pronunciation. Therefore, it is said that he aimed, through the BBC, to standardize RP, a prestige variation which mimics the institutional values of the 20th century society. This prestige associated with RP also strongly relied on the image of the British Empire, where it was made a requirement to possess. Thus, the BBC, by using RP as its standard, was presented an idealized variation which appealed to power and prestige, making it very easy to accept by the populace to the point of it becoming a desired standard. However, the BBC still needed to find a way to implement this standard. Thus, Race created in 1926 the Visory Committee of Spoken English. The committee was made up with the country's social elite. Its role was to decide on the correct pronunciation of words in spoken English, and its decisions will later on be adopted within the BBC staff and their audience. For the audience to successfully endorse this variant, the BBC highlighted that, as announcers were to be regarded as teachers, they should all speak with an RP accent while on air. Later on, the BBC also published a booklet entitled Broadcast English. In there, one could find how words should be pronounced in proper English according to the committee. These were important steps, as they clearly started to implement the committee's decision on a large scale. As a matter of fact, these were made in order to make sure that the company's influence affected even the younger generation and educate listeners, thus standardizing RP. So, did it reach Race's intended result? Well, according to Race, the BBC was fulfilling its goal. However, despite its certain influence, both announcers and populace alike in the late 1920s and in 1930s were often divided on pronunciation, and many complaints arose, like the one we have here, where the BBC staff is accused of mutilating the English language. Indeed, many people feel that his accent was not a good variation, and furthermore, it only represented a small portion of the English-speaking community. It is also worth of notice how another name for RP was Educated Southern English, so it quickly became apparent that this standard was more of a preference than an actual norm. In response to rising complaints, the BBC decided to compromise and created two distinct types of pronunciation, those who were highly recommended and those who were simply suggested. Yet, as this next statement proves, some BBC staff still weren't ready to acknowledge all types of variants as valid. Bridge singled out that the dialect of Oxfordshire as particularly savage, as locals dropped and stressed vowels at the beginning of words. Therefore, despite its efforts in preserving its position as a standard, like with any living language, the perception of correct pronunciation started to change through time, and people started to question BBC's ambiguous position as a standard.
As time passes, it became clear that the BBC has failed to standardize English. After all, the committee of BBC who wanted to make a standard English was completely discharged as the Second World War broke out. As the colonial era came to an end, most of the colonies under the British Empire began to gain their independence. This is important because the prestige of BBC English was due to the power of the British Empire. So the fall of the empire means that the fall of the prestige of the BBC English. So English used in the former British colonies, such as India, gradually began to occupy a place where BBC English used to take. And BBC started to give up the idea to correct vocabulary or pronunciation that used to be considered as non-standard English. So stereotypes were being abandoned, and a wide variety of second and foreign language accents started to be broadcast on the BBC. Let me show you an example. An Indian accent broadcast on the BBC.
Aditi, this is a stark wake-up call because I actually saw children as young as 10 carrying these big buckets of water with them. Some of them even miss their school because they have to have drinking water at home. Why is it that India has not been able to provide water for all, and has it become privileged of only a few?
That's a very good question. And, to follow up on what Jyoti was saying, that water does flow based on the slope, but very paradoxically, water also flows where the wealth is. So the richer colonies on the whole would have better water access, and the richer might be even paying lesser for water than some of the poorer colonies that you were just in there. Because for them, even if water is free, just the transaction cost of getting water is so high. So therefore, I think this is one of the saddest part of our system, that the poor have not had equitable access to water.
And Arun, what's happening in rural India? Because is the situation worse there? Most of our population is engaged in the agricultural economy. Many of them are dependent on monsoon for their crops, and also now farmers have been drawing water from the ground. There are places like the northern state of Punjab where water table has actually gone down as much as by over 150% over the years.
Southwestern India has a city called Shimoga, and around Shimoga, or the central India where there's a village called Kinhi Gadegaon near Nagpur, 100 kilometers east of Nagpur. In both these places, if you visit, all farmers are tapping into groundwater reserves and they have extremely water intensive crops. Water literacy is what we are lacking at this point in time, despite the technological advances. The water literacy is what is going to help us get through this. Rural India is at a major water distress, no doubt. At the same time, we are also having water practices which are not sustainable.
To achieve this, the use of neutral words in the BBC should be mandatory to be understood by everybody. Besides that, the idea of promoting the image of an ideal speaker led the BBC to choose its presenters among those who lacked regional accents. Definitively, English influenced a lot of aspects of people's lives since ever. Almost all the texts used in our schools follow the British standard models, since they are British publishers that mainly include their people and their culture. In this way, the native model to be imitated is the English Variety RP. The recent editions leave more space to other English speaking countries and their varieties linguistics or include, for example, an American character, but the role of British English and its culture continues to occupy a leading place.
In order to understand what is the English, the variety of English it is spoken today in the BBC, and the progress from RP to other varieties, we have chosen two of the main programs of BBC One at the moment. In the first place, we're going to talk about the 10 o'clock news. It's a really important program of the BBC as it has large audience. So that means that we could say that the presenter of the news is the most important face. For this reason, it's really important to see which English variety does he speak. Hugh Edwards is currently the presenter, so he's from Wales, so that means he has a Welsh accent. At the very beginning, the minority of viewers felt that it was inappropriate to have a presenter with a strong Welsh accent. However, he said that his decision was not to change it because he felt that it was an important part of his identity. In the second place, we're going to focus on the science fiction TV series Doctor Who. When it started in 1963, the first 6 doctors had received pronunciation English. Later on, in 1987, the Doctor was played by Sylvester McCoy and he had a Scottish accent. Later, in 2005, the reincarnation of the 10th Doctor was played by David Tennant. Although he is an actor from Scotland, he resigned to his accent and he spoke straight English with some RP. Currently, the Doctor, Jodie Whittaker, she not resigned to her accent, and she's from Yorkshire, so she has a Northern England accent, and this is reflected in the TV series. All in all, we can see that little by little we can hear more varieties in the BBC than before. We have a Welsh presenter on the 10 o'clock news, and the face of one of the most famous TV shows is a female with Yorkshire accent. So, as a conclusion, we believe and we've proved that BBC is trying to catch up with a society that is changing, especially with accents, varieties, and the English language.